Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to our special Lunch with Books program commemorating the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attack and tragedy that followed. I don't have much to say. I will say that we have a program on Tuesday, 14th, with Culture Kids. It's about the Iroquois Confederacy. They were here before to do the Sarah Lucy Bagby program. It was very well received, and they were excellent. So they'll be doing that program in honor of Constitution Day on the 14th at noon. So to get us started today, we're opening an art exhibit as well. I'll tell you more about that in a bit. I'm going to have Rabbi Lief from Temple Shalom do some opening remarks. So here he is.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I remember where I was on the morning of September 11th, 2001, and I'm willing to bet you do as well. That moment in time, and the hours that followed, are burned into our memories perpetually. I sat, stunned, watching the events unfold from a distance on television, while emotionally I was right there with those who were struggling in the city, thanks to many friends and family who were there on that day. And in the days that have followed, we are left with a dilemma. Do we let go of the bad things of our past in order to move forward? Or do we hold on even to painful memories so that we might learn from them? Franklin Roosevelt, when he was president, and our nation was attacked on December 7th, 1941, suggested that that was a day that should live in infamy. For very few of us, it is. For a declining percentage of our population who were not alive on the day when the nation was attacked, most have forgotten. It does not seem to live in infamy, and the question becomes, shouldn't an event of this magnitude be remembered? And I would argue yes. As painful as it is, as frustrating as it is, as deep as the impact has been for 20 years that have followed, our nation has been officially at war. We must remember, and we must commemorate, and we must observe this date for the significant moment that it was and remains, lest we forget not only the tragedy, but even more so the unity that followed, the hopefulness, patriotism, kindness, generosity, compassion, neighbors who had been bitterly divided. We often forget the nation was racked by a presidential election the year before that was so bitter and contested it went to court. If only that were an unfamiliar refrain today, 20 years later. We are once again bitterly divided, but in that moment, when we were attacked, we remembered what binds us together is far more significant than those things that do divide us. For that reason, we must remember, and we must keep that memory alive. Tomorrow evening, as we mark September 11th, 2021, 20 years after the attacks on our nation, here in the city of Wheeling, we'll have a service of remembrance at Heritage Port with elected officials, police, fire, homeland security, interfaith clergy from across the community, as we gather to remember and celebrate our unity as a nation, not just the tragedies that befell us then, but the struggles we are still fighting today that can only be overcome when we work together as citizens of one shared nation with liberty and justice for all. And so, as our Ohio County Public Library opens this wonderful exhibit today, let us pray together for a moment. Lord our God, we thank you for our many blessings. for health and hope, for patience and perseverance, for comfort and community. Help us to remember that we are blessed and that we ought to use our blessings to be a blessing unto others. Remind us to care for our neighbor not as a stranger, but as our fellow citizen in the engagement that is democracy. Help us to build a stronger, safer nation for all with whom we share it, and a more peaceful world for everyone, everywhere. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi. Our keynote speaker today is Dr. Kelly Close. She is Medical Director, Urgent Care of WVU Medicine Wheeling Hospital, and an emergency physician. On September 11th, 2001, Dr. Close was the coordinator of the medical response as the National Coordinator of Disaster Volunteers for the American Red Cross at Ground Zero in New York City. She's also an adjunct instructor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences. She spent the last 3 decades focused on directly improving the plight of those in need, more importantly, developing systems and policies to address their issues on a more global and sustained level. She graduated cum laude from the University of Pittsburgh Medical School and obtained a master's degree in public health and health policy and management from Yale University. Prior to 9/11, Dr. Close developed the protocols for the current Medical Reserve Corps, which were originally housed within the Red Cross. She also trained in Israel with the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli Red Cross in 2011 on disasters and bioterrorism. Here's Dr. Kelly Close.
Good afternoon. I want to just take a few minutes to tell you about what my experience was on 9/11. And we all have our own experience, but mine was a little bit unique because we did a few things that haven't been done since and weren't done prior to this. So I was the National Coordinator of Disaster Volunteers for the American Red Cross. At the time, the Red Cross was 95% volunteers, and we had basically a chapter covering every part of the United States. We covered 60,000 disasters, most of which were small house fires, floods, and so forth. I was basically overseeing the 18,000 disaster volunteers that got deployed to major disasters in Florida, New Orleans, and so forth. So I want to tell you just briefly about why Oklahoma City is important, is because the report of that bombing came out in early 2001. Basically, the Oklahoma City bombing was 2 Americans who bombed the Federal Nerve Building in Oklahoma City. There were 168 dead, including 19 children who were in a daycare on the first floor. More importantly, as far as this is concerned, 680 were actually injured. And the problem is that we learned, if you look at the picture, that what happened was it was a city block, and every volunteer personnel, anybody off duty, came flying to the scene to help. And unfortunately, they actually blocked the EMS in. So an EMS ambulance would get there, they'd hop out of their truck, go to the scene, bring a patient out, and they'd be blocked in and couldn't get the patient to the hospital. So there needed to be more local coordination. The Medical Reserve Corps was founded on this concept because even though we have federal teams called DMAT teams and USAR teams that are incredible and highly trained, they take 24 to 36 hours typically to mobilize. So especially when trauma, we talk about the golden hour. That's the first hour you need to treat traumas, or else the death and disability dramatically goes up. So what we decided to do was create these local teams because within the Red Cross, because of the fact that we had chapters all over the country, and we can use the local chapters to raise funds for it, to train them, and so forth. This was a big departure. We had actually never used medical volunteers in a medical role. Although we did have nurses on disasters, they basically were to, give Tylenol and ibuprofen and then send anybody on to higher level of care if there was anything else. They couldn't really work in a medical role. We thought we'd test this, me specifically running it, at the next disaster, which we thought would be a hurricane. As you know, the next major disaster was actually 9/11. So I'm not going to go through the whole timeline, but things to know are that basically at 8:46 in the a.m. was when the first tower was hit with a plane. I actually happened to be in Connecticut, an hour and 15 minutes out of New York City, and I was supposed to be speaking to a local Red Cross chapter, and I was going all around the country to tell them about these new medical reserve corps that we were going to be training and developing at the local chapters. Then, so I had quickly got changed. I was in a suit to go to this meeting. I got changed into my regular disaster clothes, grabbed my go bag, but all the cell phones were jammed. And it was because everybody was on their phone trying to talk to people. We were far enough away that we didn't lose our cell phone tower because of the World Trade Center, but everything got jammed, as I'm sure anybody who is old enough to remember happened everywhere. So I actually drove to the Red Cross chapter, was just about 10 minutes away. And I stopped at the local hospital and loaded my car, because I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, so I had driven there, with every mask and emergency supply I could think of. And then I proceeded to drive to ground zero. During that time, the second tower got hit. And at this point, it went from, oh, we're going to try out the Medical Reserve Corps, to we now know it's a terrorist attack. Obviously, the third flight hit the Pentagon. And then one of this advanced. There we go. So one of the people I want to point out that doesn't get as much notoriety, and I think is a true hero, the unsung hero, is this Benedict Sliney, and you can look him up. He actually was the head of operations management for the FAA. He was not the head of the FAA. And unilaterally, without the consent of the president or the head of the FAA at the time, he actually decided to ground over 4,000 planes that were in the air, or 4,000 that were in the air, and all the rest of the planes that were scheduled to take off. And that means 4,000 planes had to be rerouted, and the Red Cross was actually involved in taking care of all those people who sat in airports for a week or two. However, this was such a bold move. It was his first day on the job. So even though he had been in aviation for 25 years, he made this decision because after 3 planes had hit different targets, he felt there potentially was planes that are about to take off, and to, prevent anything else from happening. So I think that was an incredible job that he did and doesn't really get a lot of recognition for. We then had the South Tower collapse and then the North Tower. I actually go through this timeline a little bit for some of the younger people who actually don't remember this and, don't have any recollection. It was 103 minutes till all this happened. It was literally what felt like a blink of an eye to me. I got to ground zero right as the second tower was falling. I'm going to go through a video, and it's a little hard to hear, but the first couple voices are air traffic controllers. You'll then hear an Emily, who is actually a flight attendant on the first plane that crashes into the World Trade Center, and obviously she passes away. You'll then hear from people who are on one of the other flights, if their voice recordings from messages left on phones for their loved ones. We used to have phones in the headrests on airplanes that you could actually pay like $18 a minute. So that's what all these people did to use. And then there's actually, you'll hear actually one of the terrorists on Flight 93 that landed in Shanksville in Somerset. You'll hear him talk. You'll hear the fighter pilots who were deployed to try to track down some of the airplanes. And then lastly, you'll hear some people who are actually in the towers right before they collapse. So it's difficult to hear, but I think it's good for us all to remember, and then for those who weren't there to kind of hear it.
And then the one to staff and the 5 to staff. We're going on next to
United 175 here. We have some problems over here right now. And we might have a hard check over here too. You're over on that's an iPad. So, ridiculous. One from here, one here, so that's and my parents and everybody. I totally love you. We have all the way together.
Oh my God, so both powers are now.
Kansas City, it's going to Kansas City. It's on here now. Yeah, 93 traffic trees, 112 on these, on 370. Here's that we're looking at 93. 93, we would here's I got that big stop.
I love them very much, and I'm so sorry. I hope to be able to hear things and say, I love you.
We're 56855. We have, I believe it is a, only 757. Can you see him on this too? We're 56855. Say we've got to go more fast as you can.
United 93, you got information on that yet?
Yeah, yeah.
He's down?
Yes.
Why did he land?
He did not land.
He's down?
Yeah, somewhere up northeast of Camp David.
So I know that's incredibly powerful and hard to see. But one of the things that strikes me every time I watch this, and I've probably seen it 20 times now, is how calm the air traffic controllers are and the 911 operators. And that's what everybody did at this time. Everybody came together. They acted, they did their job, they worked hard. And we saw that in every corner of the world at that time. So just to go through the logistics of it, because it's important to understand what I ended up doing at Ground Zero. The World Trade Center is actually 7 buildings. The towers are 2, but the other 5 were also destroyed. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a picture of LiDAR right after 9/11. It still has the debris there. And all of the buildings were actually destroyed and ultimately taken down. More importantly, this picture shows all the affected area. And after the first 24 hours, we realized that there weren't going to be very many victims found alive. And what we then did was look at, okay, who else was affected by this? And you will see that starting from the top of the yellow area of Manhattan all the way down, this was now cordoned off on the second day by the FBI, and no one could get in that didn't have a federal response plan ID. So this is me. I'm actually driving from Connecticut. I took this picture. That's the World Trade Center towers smoking before they collapsed. This is right as they were collapsing. I was getting to ground zero. And then this is actually when I actually get to ground zero. This is daylight, and you can see there's debris everywhere. Any mask we wore clogged instantly. We also ended up just giving our masks to children and old people. I didn't have, any masks 90% of the time because we were trying to give it to anybody who had any, risk factors for serious disease at the time. I'll show you the triage area in a second, but we actually had to label everybody as either doctor, paramedic, or nurse, and I brought teams down from NYU to help me because we thought there would be a lot more victims. But where the command center was right here, the triage area at Stuyvesant High School was here, and the pile was right here. But we had to form human chains because you couldn't see more than 5 feet in front of you. And I grew up outside of New York City, and I know the area very well. I couldn't tell where I was at any given time. All the street signs and lights were blocked out, everything. So we actually had chains that went to the pile and also to the morgue, unfortunately. So this is the triage area. You can see everybody just kind of standing around looking at themselves. The only people we ended up really treating were the people who had injuries from trying to do the rescue. This is September 12th, the next day. That's actually me with the Red Cross jersey. And you can see in the background, that's where the towers were previously. So we did set up like makeshift eye washing stations because a lot of people got stuff in their eyes. There was a lot of asthma attacks. So we were coordinating getting mass amounts of nebulizers and inhalers down to ground zero. We did a lot of laceration repair, but really the very few survivors went directly to St. Vincent's Hospital. This is St. Vincent's Hospital, literally the most well-prepared hospital in the entire world. They had evacuated the entire hospital within about 30 to 40 minutes because they had dealt with the first World Trade Center bombing, and they were prepared. However, they didn't get that many victims, as we know. However, one thing they weren't prepared for, there was no hand sanitizer back there, and the World Trade Center was on the water line, so all of that area lost their water supply. So you can see the blue tank right there that actually was water that people were using to wash their hands and to bring into the hospital. The other thing is that the Red Cross, besides responsible for food, shelter, mental health activities of people on a disaster, they also were responsible for contact tracing, both in the military and domestically. And this was actually the location. I don't have a picture of it just for confidentiality of all the families, but there were thousands of family members there putting up posters from the day right after, looking for their loved ones, which we know we didn't really have much evidence of. So a few immediate implications. There were no phones. So even the disaster workers couldn't really talk really well. Even the fire departments and stuff were all on different radio wavelengths at that time. So it was an issue. So communication was identified. However, if you were in your home in a high rise below Canal Street, which was where the FBI blocked it off, you had no way to contact everyone. Your loved ones didn't know if you were alive or dead. You couldn't call 911. You didn't know what happened if you couldn't physically walk several stories down a high rise to talk to someone to find out what happened. So also, people didn't realize that this was going to be going on for weeks. People in New York aren't used to major disasters, and so most people thought it was like a snowstorm. Okay, one day of not having services and then everything would be back on. It was 3 weeks before they opened up ground zero to anybody, including no pharmacies, no fast food, no grocery stores, nothing. Everybody had left, and no one was being able to come back to provide services for people who stayed. So I will tell you, one of the biggest things I dealt with on the second night of the 12th was a dog, okay? So people would not leave their pets. We're trying to evacuate everybody, and at the time, the Red Cross was not allowed to take any pets because of the fact that we serve food and it's a Department of Health regulation. So now, since then, the Red Cross works with charities to provide shelter for pets, but I literally ended up working with the city dog pound catcher, and we labeled dogs as cared for, and like then all the dogs who had no owners anymore. So it was, I spent, you know, several hours working on dealing with the pets for a couple hours. The other thing is that on the second day we were at the incident command center, and someone said to me, I think there's people trapped in the building right next to us. And so we went over and I went up a bunch of floors, and lo and behold, there were a ton of people. This area has a lot of subsidized or rent-controlled housing that has a lot of people who are mentally ill, chronically disabled, don't speak the language. And so as a result, they didn't know what was going on and they were trapped in their apartments. So we worked with the National Guard, and the building right next to the Incident Command Center had over 30 stories. And they formed a human chain because the elevators weren't working. And by this point, it's been more than 24 hours, so all the power's gone out. So they actually had like flashlights hooked to their shoulders, and then they were passing all the people down. But we still had someone who was a schizophrenic who refused to leave. So we had to actually have our masters of social work workers go up and talk them down and try to get them out of the building. So we dealt, and that made me think, well, we just blocked off 14 city blocks that normally 1 million people live in. We probably have a ton of people like this in different buildings that have, a lot of them didn't have electricity. Most of them didn't have any water, and there was no supplies. And if you wanted to leave the area, you had to walk 14 city blocks, and a lot of people can't do that. So I actually formed these multidisciplinary outreach teams, and it was really the first time we were ever using teams with a physician, a nurse, a master's of social work, a food service person. And we had a checklist that I created overnight. And we went door to door, and we went with the manager. So we had keys. We found people who had died of heart attacks and strokes that were dead in their apartment for several days, or, you know, whenever we got to them, because it took us about 5 days to get to the whole entire area, even with over 20 teams of 10 people. And so we would identify, we had just regular workers that were volunteers that would go up and identify what the person's need was, what they wanted. And then we actually had the first ever smartphones. So there were no smartphones. Everybody had flip phones back then. And as you know, they can't do a lot of things. And they weren't working because of the cell towers at World Trade Center being down. So RIM BlackBerry was scheduled to come out with their first ever smartphone. They donated thousands of BlackBerries to us, and all of my teams got them. So we could text. So I don't know the technology behind it, but text worked fine. So everybody had a BlackBerry, and if they had a medical condition, we only had a few doctors, so they'd text the doctor and say, you need to come up, we have this. And so it really was the first time we ever used smartphones in the country. And we all became addicted to them until they wanted us to pay for them. So none of us wanted to give them back a year or two later. But the other thing that we realize is, you know, it's not like Florida where they're used to disasters all the time. People in Florida, for the most part, know that a Red Cross shelter is actually a pop-up shelter. It's in a school, it's in a library, it's in an auditorium, and it's all brand new cots. It's only for people who have been involved in a disaster. It's new food, everything's brand new. It comes out of the Red Cross storage areas. However, they thought they were going to a homeless shelter in New York City. So a lot of people in New York initially refused to go. And so we explained, at first I didn't understand why people were refusing, until someone said to me, I'll probably get, mugged or raped. And I was like, what? So we started explaining to people that in fact the shelter were safe, they were temporary, and they were a way for us to connect you to your family. We talked about the pets, the mental health. We also found a lot of physically disabled. So at the time, New York had a great policy of anybody who had really severe disease, of getting them really long home nursing so that they could stay in their home and live a somewhat normal life without being hospitalized or institutionalized. So we actually, for example, came across a 32-year-old woman who had multiple sclerosis, and she was paralyzed pretty much everywhere except for she could speak and she could move her right arm. But she was in a hospital bed, and she normally had 11 to 13 hours of home care, but her home care nurse couldn't get through the FBI block. So as a result, all the power went out, her water went out, she was stuck in a hospital bed, unable to get out or move, and for 3 days sat in her own excrement, not knowing what happened, Clearly everybody heard what happened. She thought it was the end of the world. It was very traumatic for her. She was very sick, had horrible bed sores everywhere, and we were actually able to get her out and get her help. But that's the type of thing we saw a lot throughout our going door to door. So the other thing is Chinatown is in that area, and there was actually over 5,000 people who lived in Chinatown who didn't speak the language and refused to leave. So what we did is I spent the next 3 weeks at Ground Zero bringing in services, bringing in food and water to every single area and people. We had long lists of what everybody needed, everything from picking up prescriptions, because there's no pharmacy. If people ran out of their meds or left it somewhere, they didn't have any way to get medication. We brought in water, electricity restored pretty quickly. We even got ambulances to come in. The first day, there were tons of ambulances. There were ambulances everywhere. However, once the FBI took over, they wouldn't even let ambulances in until we got the ambulance drivers screened through the federal database. And rightly so, because they thought for sure the secondary most demoralizing thing that could happen would be they send in a healthcare worker with a bomb and blow up all the workers on the pile. And so to their perspective, there was no use risking that. And so everybody had to be cleared. So it even took us a while to get buses in to bring people mass evacuate out, and also to bring ambulances for people who were having health issues. We also did a lot of notification of families. So I worked with our family services and notification programs, because we found a lot of people, and we'd write down their name and their phone numbers, and we'd call their loved ones for them and tell them that they were alive, they were safe, and this is what we were doing with and for them. So I'm going to just bring it back to here. We're not New York City. We're unlikely that we're going to have something this massive happen to us. But there are disasters all the time that this is relevant for. You have to first and foremost think about who's your most vulnerable, whether it's your daughter who has epilepsy, or your grandmother who has some type of health problem, or your cats and dogs that are near and dear to you. Who is it that's going to have the hardest time if your house burns down, if you have a massive flood, if you get struck by lightning? Because those are the most likely things to happen around here, particularly house fires. So the first thing I want to say is, for any disaster, this will take 2 seconds when you go home. Talk to the people who you love and say where you're going to go in a disaster immediately outside where you live. Okay? So I always say the worst thing that could ever happen is you go out the front door during a fire, your loved one goes out the back door, you think the loved one's still in, you go back in and die, and the loved one was fine all the time. So if you actually have a central meeting location that's close to wherever it is, and everybody knows that's where you go. If you have loved ones who come to try to find you, they know where you're supposed to be. Okay? If you're not there, then it's an issue. The second is if maybe that's compromised because locally right next to your house isn't good. Think of a neighbor that you would go to. Pick a neighbor. Tell that neighbor, listen, if my house catches on fire, I'm coming to your house. So if you hear banging at 3 in the morning and it sounds like my voice, open the door, that type of thing. So I think that's one of the most fundamental things that can make a huge difference, and it doesn't cost anything. It doesn't take much time, and it's really easy to do. I think the second is one of the things we learned in 9/11 is that communications go down. Now, my kids who are teenagers have 50 million ways to communicate through different apps and different things. I'm not sure how exactly all that's going to happen if there's a telecommunication breakdown. However, I will say that one of the things we found for phone calls, at least, is if you couldn't call your neighbor next door, but you could call your uncle in California and get right through. So I don't know, again, how this all works, but it's good to have someone outside of the area, a friend, a family member, who you're going to call if you can't find your family, someone's at work, someone's at school, someone's somewhere else at the library. If you can't reach them and they're not at that designated location, or you can't get to that location, call someone outside the area if the phones are down. Pick a person that's geographically far away. You should be able to get through and tell them where you are, what your plan is, and how to get a hold of you or where to meet. Lastly is supplies. So I'm a little bit of a doomsday prepper, so I don't think everybody has to go overboard. But particularly, there's 2 places that you should have at least a small kit. So the first is in your car. Obviously, first aid stuff is always good. As a physician, I always want you to have anything to stop the bleed and that type of stuff. However, the other things that are really important, if you get, your car breaks down or you slide off the road in a snowstorm, you don't want someone to hit you because they don't see you. So one of the most important things to do is get flares or those little triangles that like reflect so that you can mark it on the road before they get to your car so you don't get hit and killed. Jumper cables are always good to have, but another thing that's critical is actually during the winter in particular. I have a summer bag and a winter bag. Summer bag has like the EpiPen for allergic reactions, but is that you have those reflector blankets. So they keep you warm, they keep you safe because people can see you. They come in little packs about this big. I think you can buy them on Amazon for like 10, 20 bucks, something like that. But those are important because in any snowstorm, 911 is crushed. And so is AAA. So if you're like, well, I have AAA, well, they're going to take 4 hours to get to you in a major snowstorm or a massive flooding or any other natural disaster that tends to happen in this area. So I would say put together a little go bag. There's a website called ready.gov. You can go really crazy with all this stuff. I actually have a big, huge bag of stuff, including, an AED. So, but I think even just having a small one will help you. The second is a go bag at home. Most important, this is stuff that you need in the first 24 to 48 hours, up to 3 days. If your house burns down, you want to have a backup supply of your meds. You want to have a backup supply of like dog food or whatever. You want to have anything that you deem critical in the first 24 hours. After that, you can go to stores and get stuff and buy anything. The Red Cross actually will provide you vouchers or a debit card to go get any of your essential supplies. But it's really hard to get medications on the fly, especially if you just had it refilled, you have to fight with insurance and all that other stuff. So I would say just keep a couple extra to hold you over. So lastly, I just want to say, as far as September 11th, remember the people who died. I think for people who were too young to remember this, the History Channel is having a series of small videos about this, and I have nothing to do with the History Channel, but I saw briefs of them and they looked pretty good and not too long and not too difficult. But get an understanding, because even for us, I actually did not see a minute of media coverage on 9/11. I was at Ground Zero. I worked the hardest I've ever worked in my entire life the next year because we really thought there was another terrorist attack coming. So I don't think I ever saw a single TV show or anything for at least a year after. And then it all kind of hit me the year anniversary. So I saw all the video on the year anniversary, and there was a lot of stuff I didn't know was going on. I had a satellite phone, so I was also helping to coordinate the Pentagon and Shanksville, but I wasn't seeing all the different viewpoints of what was going on. So I think, even if you've kind of been there and you remember it, I'm going to watch those because I think they'll be educational, and they help guide a lot of decisions that have been made since over the past 20 years, politically especially. And then also for anybody who is actually involved, or I even say we saw a lot, the Red Cross ran mental health services across the country for years after 9/11 for anyone suffering from PTSD or any other mental health issues related to 9/11. And one of the things we found was, believe it or not, there was a lot of PTSD in people watching it on TV. And the reason is they had some other traumatic event in their life. They were raped. They had someone killed in their family. They just recently had a loss of a loved one unrelated to any terrorism. And they really suffered because this was another traumatic event on top of one they had already personally suffered. So reach out to the people who are around you and talk to them and see everybody remembered where exactly they were on 9/11. And it's always good to kind of talk it out and remember all of it. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Close. And now we come to the reason we're having this program today, which really is to open the exhibit of art that will be allowing you to see after we have another presentation from the artist herself. Georgia Tambasis earned a degree in nursing from Thiel College and worked in the field for over a decade. She pursued her interest in art after. and received a BFA from Youngstown State University and an MFA from the University of Texas at San Antonio. She has received numerous awards and honorable mentions in national and regional exhibitions. Currently, she is an artist, curator, and educator living in Wheeling, and her artwork includes drawing, printmaking, painting, sculpture, and ceramics. And she's going to tell you about the exhibit and some of the methods that she used. Here's Georgia Tambasis.
I don't have a PowerPoint, so I am going to read what I wrote for you guys today. And I am going to take my mask off because I can't talk really loud. Reflections of September 11th, 20 years of sorrow. Hello everyone. First, I would like to thank the Ohio County Public Library and Sean Duffy, Director of Programming, for organizing this event. I would also like to thank the staff at the library for opening doors and assisting me. And I would like to thank my friend, Robin Moss, gallery exhibition preparer, who graciously traveled from Youngstown, Ohio to assist me with editing. I had way too much work for this space and installing the exhibition. I would also like to thank Rabbi Lief for his prayer, my fellow presenters, and all of you for being here today to remember this somber event that happened 20 years ago tomorrow. How did I become part of this event? In late July, early August, Sean Duffy and I were talking about upcoming events at the library. During our conversation, I asked if he was going to do an event around 9/11. And of course, he said that he was planning to have some speakers. During our discussion, I mentioned that I had a series of artwork that I did at the event as the event was unfolding. He asked if I wanted to show that work, and I said, yes, if I can find it. This led me to search my house, attic, basement, garage for the artwork. I had packed it away and had not looked at it for 20 years. When I unearthed it, I was struck by how looking at it immediately transported me back to that point in time. I felt like someone punched me in the stomach. I was experiencing the event all over again. The feelings of disbelief, isolation, loss, pain, confusion, but mostly this feeling of stillness, not being able to move. That feeling came back. I did not want to remember. I did not want to experience the moment again. I did not want to look at my own images. They made me feel so exposed and raw. They are personal relics from my past. Why did I make them? They are my personal experience, my memories. Should I share them with others? What would you see in these images? Are these images going to resonate with your experiences, feelings, and thoughts? Maybe it is safer to share them now, 20 years later. Maybe someone else can interpret and see something I don't see in these images. Maybe they can connect to some of my feelings expressed in this body of work, or maybe they can relate to the process of how I went about making the work. My hopes are that these images can connect us in some way, even if it is for a fleeting moment. My decision to show this work was reinforced by a recent conversation with a poet friend. We were talking about the possibility of this exhibit, and she mentioned that a few years ago, when she was teaching, her class fell on 9/11, on the 9/11 date, and she decided to do something related to this event. Later that day, when walking down the hall, she overheard students saying, "All we hear today is 9/11, 9/11, 9/11. Why do we care? We were only 4. Thus, the reason for showing this work 20 years later was answered. We should care. It makes us better people to care. I teach art classes, and I try to constantly get across to my students the importance of artifacts or art objects, such as the paintings in caves, half-broken statuettes, architectural sites, Stonehenge, and the concentration camps in Germany, which were left behind by the people before us. For me, these fragments of the past make the past more real. Having visited the concentration camps, I walked away with a deeper and more empathetic understanding for what the people experienced. This was reason enough to do this exhibition. Where was I when the event happened? I had just started graduate school at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I remember hearing something on the radio about the planes that morning, but I did not pay close attention because I was getting ready to go to school. You see, I was too busy with my mundane everyday life. When I arrived in my studio, everything was quiet. I noticed everyone, my fellow students and some faculty, gathered around the TV in the sculpture area. They seemed hypnotized by the screen. Their hypnotic, zombie-like, yet panic-stricken faces made me look away. I did not want to see. I wanted to be alone. I hid in my studio the rest of the day, listening to the radio, I think it was NPR, as the events unfolded, and completed some of the work you will see in this exhibit. Confusion, the sky grew darker. The first set of work, recently titled Confusion, the Sky Grew Darker, was a spontaneous reaction. I started carving a piece of found wood with some nearby wood block tools that I poured ink, black, purple, yellow, whatever colors were around my general vicinity, on top of the wood block. Tore sketchbook paper out of my sketchbook pad and pressed them onto the carved wood. I spent most of the day trying to avoid people and the TV by making this series of monoprints. I remember hearing about the second plane, and I remember hearing about the collapse of the towers, the dust, the smoke, but mostly I remember the word falling, used a lot. When I was making the images, I did not know what I was making. I just knew I had to do something. And as an artist, I was doing something. I was making monoprints. As I look at these images now, 20 years later, I see flickers of sparkling purple dust in the air, veils and whirls of blue smoke, blue sky, planes hitting buildings, and things falling. It's the same woodblock, but depending on the colors and pressure applied, each one plays out a different scene as it was running through my mind. Now my memories have faded like some monoprints in the series. Here I want to stop and say that I never looked at images of this event until this August 2021, and I only looked at one or two for 5 minutes. Even today, I couldn't look at the images. I don't have a desire to look. I think that by producing these images, I wanted to be part of the event instead of passively looking at the destruction. Maybe I wanted some distancing, and maybe I wanted my own images to be etched in my brain. Later, I took the same woodblock print and used oil-based printmaking ink, which is more permanent, and used the printing press to make more images with different colors on different colored paper. These pieces have a more solid and finished look. There's permanence that permeates through them. As I was looking at this series, I was reminded of a novel, Falling Man, by Don DeLillo, which I have here. This novel was published in 2007, and it is based on one man's experience of having survived this event, and how he and his family deal with it. It is uncanny how this novel captures how I interpret these images, especially the feelings of stillness and falling. Thus, I titled this series After Effects, Falling. I would like to read to you a short passage from the novel that captures the image of the falling man as seen in photographs, which I have not seen. The man headlong, the towers behind him, the mass of the towers filled the frame of the picture, the man falling, the towers contiguous behind him. Headlong, free fall, she thought, and this picture burned a hole in her mind and heart. Dear God, he was falling angel, and his beauty was horrific. Wakefulness, trying to make sense of things. The orange and blue tape series, recently titled Wakefulness, Trying to Make Sense of Things, was made that night, or at least within a few days of that event. I know that it was night because I could not sleep. I was in my studio at UTSA feeling restless, confused, nervous, and edgy. I had to get some order and control back because what I was hearing on the radio and from others around me was not making sense. I wanted to organize my thoughts. Spotting this glossy white photo paper that was given to me, I picked it up and came up with a plan. I grabbed some readily available materials, which consisted of black and orange electrical tape, a regular number 2 pencil, a colored blue pencil, and a red ink acrylic-based glue or polyurethane, don't remember which, and an old brush. And I methodically started to lay down my thoughts in the following exact order. It had to be exact. The order was important. I wanted some control. Tear off a piece of black tape, tape it vertically on the top center of the paper. Tear off a piece of orange tape and tape it horizontally on top of the black tape. Next, I quickly wrote down the first thought that came into my head. First, I wrote my thought in Greek. My first language is Greek, with pencil. And then I translated it in English underneath the Greek with blue color pencil. For the next one, I did the opposite. I wrote my thought in Greek and blue color pencil and translated it in English with pencil. It had to be that way. It had in that sequence. I messed up the order in one of them, and I had to stretch it out and rewrite it in the planned order. See if you can find which one it is in the series. After that thought was written down, I made the mark that expressed the thought. I loaded the brush with ink and glue and poured it on the paper. The action had to be quick. The mark had to express the thought. I was in a Zen-like trance. I continued this process, one piece of paper after another, until I finished the stack of paper. I wanted to capture more than the thought. I wanted to visually capture the essence of the thought, the immediacy, urgency, raw energy, and spirit of that moment. When I was finished with the stack, I wanted to set them free. I think it was 4 a.m. when I took them to the other side of campus and laid them on the floor, equally spaced apart on each side of the long, wide hallway that connected the art building to the architecture building. It was a beautiful hallway with windows on each side. The next day, I walked down the hallway and my pieces were laying there untouched, but I noticed that someone had painted on the bottom of some of them in capital letters with purple paint, compassion, peace, manifest love, and manifest compassion. I remember people stopping to look at them, then staring out the windows. The sun was shining, the light was bright, and my pieces laid bare for everyone and anyone to do as they wish. I laid bare my inner thoughts for everyone to see, and this freed and calmed me in some way. The pieces laid in that hallway for about a month, and nobody moved them or destroyed them, with the exception of the person that painted the additional words on them. I placed them in the hallway anonymously, and later I picked them up and put them away. I had not looked at them for 20 years. They were forgotten. There are 27 in this series, and as I look at them now, I'm still having the same thoughts and asking the same questions. In blue, how many people? In pencil, Hoshi Anthropi. In blue, in pencil. Yesterday I cried in my car. In blue. We continue to build fences. For what? In pencil. Προσπαθούμε να φτιάξουμε φρακές. Γιατί πράγμα? After Effects Confined Panic Series. Building Fences takes me to the After Effects Confined Panic Series, again recently titled. This series was done within the same month of the event. When I reflect on these pieces, I feel the same, I see and feel fear. Fear is all around me. I see it in the downtown streets of San Antonio, on the campus of the university. I see it in children's faces. The world has changed. We are locked in. We closed our borders. People are scared. We spy on each other. We report suspicious activity. We arrest people, and we build fences and defenses. I see people behind barbed wire fences, locked in or locked out. The variation of this RO of fear and confined panic was created by the printmaking and intaglio process. I started on engraving dry point first, then used the etching technique to further explore variations of the same on the same copper plate. In the engraving and dry point processes, I cut the copper plate by using a cutting tool called a burr by hand. Once the plate is inked, wiped off, and ran through the press, the lines are printed in the color of the ink. It is opposite of the wood carving technique, where the uncut shapes are printed and the lines remain white. In the etching process, the corrosive action of acid was applied. This creates a softer line in the image versus the cleaner line of the engraving. Each of these hand-pulled prints is unique, even though the same matrix or plate was used, because I experimented with printing on various colors of paper, applied more than one color of ink in one printing, and I added more lines after the first printing. Looking at these now, I see how creating a variation of the theme from the same copper plate implies how one event can be perceived in different ways. I have written the words "this" at the bottom of these pieces, and I printed some in reverse. I will let you interpret this in your own way. After Effects, United, Divided White, and Divided Black are woodblock prints completed within the same period, fall 2001. United has the same woodblock overlapping in the middle and speaks of the darkness and damage as seen in the sharp cuts through the wood, but also speaks of the unity, the overlapping area in the middle that was felt immediately afterwards. Of course, that unity did not last, and the two pieces with deep hypertrophic and keloid scars next to this one convey the divided worlds that we live in today. X marks the spot. I see permanence. It's not going to go away. Global fear, emerging memories. were done last month, August 2021, while reflecting on the event of 20 years later, living in Wheeling, West Virginia. These are fresh, and I'm not sure how to interpret them. I invite you to do that. Global fear speaks of the same aura of fear that we experienced during 9/11. The skulls, yin-yang position lurk in the background. They follow us through our various paths. Merging memories, the past melts into the present. In summary, this body of work is my personal artistic reaction and reflection of 9/11, 20 years ago from today. Although I talked about my feelings as I remembered them while I was doing the work and reflected on them 20 years later, I want the work to remain open to interpretation. I want to invite you to look at the work and reflect on what you see. History is important. We should reflect and we should care. That is what I have to say about the work that you'll see in this exhibit. I also have brought some extra work that I will talk to you when you guys look at the work a little bit first. Lastly, I debated about reading this poem. It's a little raw, and I think I'm going to read it. And it's sort of a trope on Allen Ginsberg asking America some questions. America, I'm asking you. America, what do you want? Are you awake? What are you afraid of? I'm asking you again and again. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? What do you want? I'm asking you. I'll keep asking you. What do you want? Stay still. Pay attention. What do you want? America, Bob says you gotta know by now. You're older than that now. America, take a look at yourself. Ginsberg is still asking, who are you? What do you want? Why can't you tell me, us? What are you afraid of, America? America, I'm still asking you, what do you want? And I'll leave you with that in closing. Yes, we'll turn the lights on. You're invited to look at the artwork. And I have if you want a further explanation of the processes that I use, you can come up on this table and I will share that with you. I brought some of the actual plates that I used that I saved. I couldn't find the original woodblock tape, but I did find the fences one with the copper plate you could look at, and I can explain how I did that. And I have actually more images than the images that you have here. You can actually very carefully, if you'd like, you can look through the images. And I wasn't able to put all of these images there, so I have two here. But I can also, if you have any questions, please feel free to come and ask me.
Thank you.
Want to ask me a question? Thank you. I appreciate it. I learned, the PTSD one. Thank you for I think that there's more to that issue. It's not because I couldn't look at the images. I was
I retired in 2000.
I was.
A year ago.
I'm